I watched the woman who had just called me a penniless parasite drop her crystal champagne flute. It shattered against the marble floor of the Plaza Hotel, silencing the entire ballroom. For 2 years, Eleanor Harrington had made my life a living hell, convinced I was a commoner, desperate for her son's trust fund. But as the heavy mahogany doors swung open and the royal guard announced my father's arrival, the color drained from her perfectly lifted face. To understand how I ended up in the crosshairs of New York's most vicious society matriarch, you have to understand why I was hiding in the first place. My name is Genevieve. To the colleagues at Christie's auction house in Manhattan, where I worked as a junior specialist in Impressionist art, I was Eve Laurent, a quiet, hard-working girl from a modest town near the Swiss border. I lived in a walk-up apartment in the West Village, drank cheap bodega coffee, and took the subway like everyone else. But my passport, safely locked in a biometric safe hidden in my closet, bore a different name: Her Royal Highness Crown Princess Genevieve of the House of Saxe. My father was the reigning monarch of a small but immensely wealthy sovereign European state. I grew up in a world of suffocating protocol, where every friendship was a calculated political move, and every suitor was vetted for his pedigree and geopolitical value. After graduating from Institut La Rosey, the impossibly exclusive Swiss boarding school, where I was surrounded by the children of billionaires and dictators, who only wanted to be my friend for the sheer social capital, I begged my father for 3 years of freedom. 3 years to live as a normal woman in a city where no one cared about European royalty unless they were on the cover of a tabloid. Reluctantly, he agreed under the condition that my lead royal protection officer, a former SAS operative named Gareth, remained within a 2-block radius at all times. For the first year, life was intoxicatingly mundane. I learned how to hail a yellow cab in the rain. I learned how to budget a mediocre salary. And then during a private viewing of a recently discovered Degas sketch, I met Nathaniel Harrington. Nathaniel was the heir apparent to Harrington and Sons Equity, a legacy Wall Street firm that managed wealth for families who had arrived in America on the Mayflower. He was devastatingly handsome, with the kind of effortless East Coast charm cultivated on the rowing team at Yale. When he approached me staring at the Degas with a bemused smile, he didn't see a princess. He saw a girl in a Zara blazer who knew too much about 19th century pastels. "I don't understand it," he confessed, handing me a glass of sparkling water. "It looks like someone spilled chalk on paper." "It's about the movement, not the clarity," I replied, pointing to the delicate arch of the ballerina's foot. "He captures the exact second before she takes flight." Nathaniel looked away from the painting and directly into my eyes. "I think I'm beginning to see the appeal." It was a textbook line, but it worked. We went to dinner that night at a tiny, dimly lit Italian place in Soho. He didn't try to impress me with his family's money, mostly because I actively steered the conversation away from wealth. I told him my father worked in government administration back home, a massive understatement considering my father was the government, and that my mother had passed away when I was young, which was painfully true. For the first 6 months, our relationship was a beautiful, insulated bubble. We spent Sunday mornings eating bagels in Central Park, shielded from the reality of his aristocratic world and my royal one. Gareth, my bodyguard, posed as a private driver, or simply blended into the crowds, a silent ghost ensuring my safety, while I fell dangerously deeply in love. Nathaniel made me feel chosen, not because of my bloodline, not because I was the heir to a crown, but just because I was Eve. I began to seriously consider telling him the truth. I practiced the speech in my bathroom mirror, trying to find the words to explain that the woman he was sharing a $5 slice of pizza with owned a collection of tiaras that predated the French Revolution. But before I could find the right moment, the bubble burst. Summer arrived, and Nathaniel insisted it was time for me to meet his family. "It's just a casual weekend," he promised, kissing the top of my head as we packed my duffel bag. "We're going out to Highfield. That's my mother's estate in Southampton. She's hosting a small dinner on Saturday, but otherwise it's just family." I should have known that in the Harrington lexicon, casual was a weaponized term. As Nathaniel's black Range Rover cruised down Meadow Lane, the absolute pinnacle of Hampton's real estate, my stomach tied itself into a knot. I wasn't intimidated by the wealth I grew up in a literal palace. but I was terrified of the scrutiny. We pulled through a set of imposing wrought iron gates, the gravel crunching beneath the tires, as a sprawling Gatsby-esque mansion came into view. Standing on the portico, flanked by two impeccably dressed staff members, was Eleanor Harrington. Even from a distance, I could feel the temperature drop. Eleanor was a woman who weaponized her elegance. She wore a pristine white linen Chanel suit, her icy blonde hair styled in an immaculate blowout that defied the humid coastal breeze. As I stepped out of the car, her pale blue eyes locked onto me, scanning me from head to toe, like a customs officer inspecting contraband. "Mother," Nathaniel said, greeting her with a kiss on the cheek. "This is Eve." Eleanor didn't extend her hand. Instead, she offered a tight, terrifyingly polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Eve, how rustic. Nathaniel has told me absolutely nothing about you, which usually means he's either profoundly embarrassed or trying to protect me from something. Let's go inside, shall we?" And just like that, the war began. The interior of Highfield was a monument to generational wealth carefully curated to make outsiders feel spectacularly insignificant. It smelled of lemon oil, old paper, and sea salt. As a maid took my coat, Eleanor immediately took control of the narrative. "I hope you brought something suitable for dinner tonight, Eve," Eleanor remarked, trailing her fingers over a Ming Dynasty vase in the hallway. "The Astors are dropping by. Bitsy Astor is a dear friend. Have you met her in the city?" "No, I suppose you wouldn't run in those circles. I believe Nathaniel mentioned you work in retail." "I work at Christie's Mrs. Harrington, in the Impressionist department." I corrected her gently, keeping my voice perfectly level. "Ah, an employee." She noted as if I had just confessed to cleaning the floors. She turned to her son. "Nathaniel, darling, why don't you go speak with your father? He's in his study. I'd like to get to know your little friend." Nathaniel gave my hand a quick, reassuring squeeze and disappeared down the hall. The moment he was out of sight, Eleanor's veneer of polite hostility hardened into something sharp and direct. She led me into a sunroom overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. "Let's skip the pleasantries, Eve. I'm a very busy woman. Where are your people from?" "I'm originally from Europe, Mrs. Harrington, a small country mostly near the Swiss and German borders." A vague answer usually hides a disappointing truth, she said, pouring herself a glass of iced tea without offering me one. "And what does your family do?" "My father is a public servant." Eleanor let out a sharp, aristocratic bark of a laugh. "A bureaucrat. Wonderful. Tell me, Eve, what exactly are your intentions with my son? Because if you think you've stumbled upon a golden ticket, I assure you Harrington money is kept tightly under lock and key." I felt a hot flush of anger rise in my chest, but years of diplomatic training kicked in. My father had taught me how to handle hostile foreign dignitaries before I even had my driver's license. Eleanor Harrington was merely a localized version of a minor despot. "My intentions are to spend time with the man I care about," I replied smoothly. "I have my own career, and I assure you I am entirely self-sufficient." Eleanor's eyes flicked down to my wrist. I was wearing a vintage Patek Philippe Calatrava, a gift from my father on my 18th birthday. It was a masterpiece of quiet luxury, lacking the garish diamonds that nouveau riche socialites love to flaunt. "A sweet little replica," she noted, her voice dripping with condescension. "You know there is no shame in being poor, Eve, but there is a deep pathetic shame in pretending to be something you are not." I smiled, my heart pounding with a dangerous mix of fury and amusement. If only you knew, I thought. The dinner that evening was an exercise in psychological warfare. Eleanor had seated me at the far end of the long mahogany table, flanked by Arthur Harrington, Nathaniel's passive, silent father, who seemed entirely beaten down by his wife and Bitsy Astor, a woman whose face was pulled so tight she looked permanently surprised. Throughout the meal, Eleanor and Bitsy spoke in a rapid-fire code of high society name-dropping, intentionally designing the conversation to exclude me. They talked about summering in Nantucket, the wait lists for Hermes Birkin bags, and the tragedy of the new money families buying up property in Aspen. Nathaniel Bitsy called out across the table, completely ignoring my presence next to her. How is Caroline doing? I always thought you two made the most stunning couple. Her family's estate in Newport is just divine. Nathaniel looked incredibly uncomfortable, glancing at me before looking down at his plate. Caroline is married, Bitsy, and I'm very happy with Eve. But for now, Eleanor interjected loudly, taking a slow sip of her Cabernet. Youthful rebellions are so healthy for a young man's development. He gets it out of his system before settling down with someone of substance, someone from our world. I placed my silver fork down on the porcelain plate, the faint clink echoing in the dining room. I looked directly at Eleanor. And what world is that Mrs. Harrington? The table fell silent. Bitsy gasped softly. Eleanor's eyes narrowed into slits. A world of legacy, my dear. Eleanor said, her voice turning to ice. A world where families have spent generations building empires, preserving culture, and understanding the responsibilities of true wealth, something a girl who sells paintings for a living could never possibly comprehend. I thought of my family's lineage stretching back 800 years. I thought of the National Archives bearing my ancestors' signatures, the castles that had stood against sieges, the charitable foundations my family ran that funded entire hospitals. The sheer audacity of this woman whose wealth was barely a century old, lecturing me on legacy, was almost laughable, but I held my tongue. I looked at Nathaniel, waiting for him to defend me, waiting for him to draw a line in the sand. Instead, Nathaniel offered a weak, placating smile. Mother, please, let's just enjoy the meal. The sea base is excellent. My heart sank. In that one moment of cowardice, the perfect illusion of Nathaniel Harrington began to crack. He wasn't a man standing beside his partner. He was a boy terrified of his mother's checkbook. The rest of the weekend passed in a haze of passive-aggressive slights and calculated exclusions. By the time Sunday afternoon arrived, I was exhausted. I was packing my duffel bag in the guest bedroom, which Eleanor had pointedly placed as far away from Nathaniel's room as possible, when the door clicked open. Eleanor stepped inside, closing the door firmly behind her. She wasn't wearing her hostessing smile anymore. She looked like a predator that had finally cornered its prey. Let's not drag this out, Eve, she said coldly. She walked over to the small writing desk in the corner, pulled a leather-bound checkbook from her Chanel handbag, and unscrewed a gold Mont Blanc pen. Drag what out? I asked, zipping up my bag. This little charade. Eleanor began to write the scratch of the pen loud in the quiet room. I've run a background check on you. Genevieve Laurent. No prominent family ties a meager bank account living in a rented shoebox in the West Village. You're a very pretty, very ambitious gold digger, and frankly, you're boring me. She tore the check from the book and walked over, holding it out between two manicured fingers. Here, $500,000, drawn from my personal Chase private client account. It's more money than you or your bureaucratic little father will see in a lifetime. Take it, pack your bag, and take the train back to the city. I never want to see you near my son again. I stared at the slip of paper in her hand. $500,000. To the Harrington family, it was the cost of a nuisance. To Yves Laurent, the gallery assistant, it was life-changing money. But to Her Royal Highness Crown Princess Genevieve, it wouldn't even cover the annual maintenance of my family's winter chalet in St. Moritz. I didn't reach for the check. I stood up straight, letting my posture shift into the rigid, perfect alignment ingrained in me by decades of royal protocol. You are making a very foolish mistake, Mrs. Harrington. I said, my voice completely devoid of the deferential warmth I had been faking all weekend. Eleanor let out a sharp, condescending laugh. Oh, am I? Are you going to threaten me, little girl? Are you going to tell Nathaniel? Go ahead. But understand this, Harrington money is controlled by a trust. If Nathaniel marries without my approval, he gets nothing. He loses his position at the firm. He loses his inheritance. He loses everything that makes him who he is. Do you really think he loves you enough to become poor for you? Her words hit me like a physical blow, not because I feared poverty, but because I suddenly realized she was right about Nathaniel. I'd seen him shy away from her at dinner. I'd seen his compliance. He loved the comfort of his wealth more than he loved me. "Keep your money," I said quietly, stepping past her and grabbing my bag. "You couldn't possibly afford me." I walked out of the room, leaving Eleanor fuming, the check fluttering to the floor. I found Nathaniel in the driveway loading his golf clubs into the Range Rover. "Hey," he smiled, oblivious to the storm brewing. "Ready to head back to the city?" I threw my bag into the back seat and looked at him. "Your mother just offered me $500,000 to leave you." Nathaniel froze. The color drained from his face, and for a split second I hoped he would explode with rage. I hoped he would storm back into the house, confront his mother, and prove to me that he was the man I fell in love with at the gallery. Instead, he let out a heavy sigh and ran a hand through his hair. "Look, Eve, she's just intense. She's fiercely protective of the family name. She did the same thing to my brother's college girlfriend. Just let it blow over. She'll warm up to you eventually." "Let it blow over," I repeated, my voice shaking with disbelief. "Nathaniel, she called me a gold digger. She actively tried to buy me off like a stray dog. And your response is to tell me to wait for her to warm up. What do you want me to do, Eve?" He snapped, his own frustration boiling over. "Cut off my mother, lose my trust fund. She controls the board at the firm. I can't go to war with her over this. Just play the game for a little while. The Harrington Winter Gala is next month at the Plaza. Come as my date, keep your head down, smile at the board members, and let her feel like she's in control. Once we're married, we won't have to deal with her as much." I stared at him, truly seeing him for the first time. The East Coast charm, the tailored suits, the easy laughter, it was all a facade covering a terrified, spineless boy. He wanted me to bow my head, endure the abuse and grovel for a place in a family that wasn't worthy of shining my shoes. "I'll go to the gala," I said softly, a dangerous cold resolve settling into my bones. "But I will not be keeping my head down." The ride back to Manhattan was suffocatingly quiet. Over the next 3 weeks, our relationship deteriorated into a hollow pantomime. Nathaniel pretended everything was fine, ignoring the massive chasm that had opened between us. Meanwhile, Eleanor ramped up her psychological warfare. She accidentally left me off the primary guest list for the gala, forcing Nathaniel to list me as his +1 rather than an invited guest. She had her assistant send me an insulting email detailing the strict black tie dress code, heavily implying I wouldn't know how to dress myself properly. The final straw came 3 days before the event. I was at Christie's cataloging a newly acquired Impressionist collection when an unsealed envelope was delivered to my desk by a courier. Inside was the seating chart for the gala. Eleanor had placed herself Nathaniel and Bitsy Astor at table 1 right by the podium. She had placed me at table 42, in the back corner, next to the kitchen doors, seated with the event's contracted florists and audio-visual technicians. It was a public execution. She was going to humiliate me in front of 500 of New York's elite, forcing Nathaniel to choose between sitting with his mother at the head table or sitting with the gold digger by the kitchen. And I knew with sickening certainty that Nathaniel would choose table 1. I calmly folded the seating chart and slipped it into my purse. I walked out of the gallery, stepped into the crisp autumn air of Rockefeller Center, and pulled out my secure encrypted mobile phone. I bypassed my usual contacts and pressed a single button on speed dial. It rang twice before a deep authoritative voice answered, "Royal Secretariat, state your authorization code." "Echo Bravo 79, I replied. "Connect me to His Majesty." There was a brief pause, a click, and then my father's voice came through the line, warm and slightly surprised. "Genevieve, my darling, it is the middle of the working day in New York. Is everything all right? Has Gareth reported a security issue?" Tears of frustration and profound relief pricked at the corners of my eyes. I was so tired of pretending to be small. I was so tired of letting a vicious, small-minded woman treat me like dirt. Papa," I said, my voice trembling before hardening into absolute steel. "I need you to come to New York." There was a heavy silence on the line. My father was not a man who took spontaneous trips. The movement of a reigning monarch required diplomatic clearances, Secret Service coordination, and millions of dollars in logistics. Has someone harmed you, Genevieve? He asked, his voice dropping an octave, slipping into the terrifying, commanding tone that made foreign ministers sweat. Someone has insulted our family, I said quietly. Someone who believes I am a peasant desperate for their money. There is a gala this Saturday at the Plaza Hotel. I want you to attend as my guest. And Papa, yes, my dear. Don't come quietly. Bring the full detail. A low, rumbling chuckle echoed through the phone. I shall notify the State Department immediately. See you on Saturday, Princess. The transformation from gallery assistant to reigning royal does not happen overnight. It requires a symphony of perfectly executed logistics. The moment I hung up the phone with my father, the invisible machinery of the House of Lean Sachs whirred to life across 2 continents. For 2 years, Gareth had played the role of my stoic, underpaid private driver. On Thursday morning, when I walked out of my West Village apartment, he wasn't leaning against the dented Toyota Camry we usually used. Instead, he was standing at rigid attention beside a black armor-plated Cadillac Escalade with diplomatic plates. He wore a perfectly tailored midnight blue suit, an earpiece curling behind his ear, and a terrifyingly blank expression. "Good morning, Your Royal Highness," Gareth said, opening the heavy ballistic door for me. It was the first time he had used my title since I arrived in New York. "Good morning, Gareth. I assume the State Department has been briefed?" "Yes, ma'am. The United States Diplomatic Security Service has been entirely cooperative. His Majesty's flight plan into JFK is secured. The Waldorf Astoria has cleared their presidential suite and the surrounding floors. We have full NYPD escort clearance for Saturday night." I settled into the plush leather seat, feeling a familiar heavy mantle settling over my shoulders. The girl who drank bodega coffee and tolerated Nathaniel's spinelessness was gone. Over the next 48 hours, the illusion of Yves Laurent was systematically dismantled. The Royal Protocol activation, security escalation. 2 additional protection officers flew in from Europe, seamlessly integrating into my daily routine. The West Village apartment was swept for bugs and secured. Harksarheim. Diplomatic liaison. The European ambassador to the UN, a trusted friend of my father named Henri Castille, was dispatched to coordinate the king's arrival with New York's elite security apparatus. Torchum. The wardrobe. I canceled my shift at Christie's and took a private elevator to the VIP styling suites at Bergdorf Goodman. I bypassed the understated blending-in pieces I usually favored. Instead, I selected a vintage archival Elie Saab haute couture gown in a shade of deep sapphire blue. It was a dress meant to command a room, not blend into one. But a royal does not assert dominance with mere fabric. The true weaponry lay in the vault. On Friday afternoon, Gareth escorted me to the subterranean private vaults of the Cartier mansion on Fifth Avenue. As a sovereign family, we kept certain heirlooms dispersed globally in secure locations. The vault manager, a discreet Swiss gentleman, bowed low as he presented the velvet box. Inside lay the Lean Sachs Cascade, a necklace commissioned in 1912 by my great-grandfather. It featured a staggering 72 carats of flawless D-color diamonds, culminating in a breathtaking pear-shaped sapphire the size of a quail's egg. It was a piece of jewelry that didn't just scream wealth. It whispered generational, untouchable power. My phone buzzed in my clutch. It was a text from Nathaniel. "Nathaniel. Hey, Eve. Just confirming you have the details for tomorrow. Remember black tie? My mother is stressed about the board members, so please just keep a low profile. I have to sit at table 1 for appearances, but I'll find you after the main course. Love you." I stared at the screen, a cold smile touching my lips. Appearances. He was about to learn exactly what that word meant. Genevieve, I wouldn't miss it for the world. See you there. The Harrington Winter Gala was the crown jewel of New York's autumn social season, a charity masquerade in name, but a brutal hierarchy check in practice. The Plaza Hotel's grand ballroom had been transformed into a winter wonderland, dripping in white orchids, crystal chandeliers, and the sheer palpable arrogance of the ultra-rich. Eleanor Harrington stood near the sweeping staircase holding court. She wore a severe metallic Oscar de la Renta gown that made her look like a perfectly polished missile. Nathaniel stood beside her, looking devastatingly handsome but distinctly uneasy, his eyes scanning the arriving guests. Bitsy Astor and a cadre of Wall Street wives flanked them, sipping Dom Perignon and murmuring judgments behind their manicured hands. I did not arrive in my diplomatic convoy. I wanted my father's entrance to be the killing blow, so I instructed Gareth to drop me off quietly at the side entrance. I checked my wool coat, took a deep breath, and walked into the ballroom. The moment I stepped through the gilded arches, the atmosphere in the room physically shifted. When you wear a masterpiece of haute couture and 72 carats of royal history, you don't just walk into a room, you part it. Conversations faltered, heads turned. The sapphire at my throat caught the light of 1,000 chandelier crystals, refracting a blinding oceanic blue across the faces of the nearest guests. I saw Nathaniel first. His jaw slackened. The glass of champagne in his hand tilted dangerously, threatening to spill over his tuxedo. He had only ever seen me in vintage blazers and understated cocktail dresses. He was looking at a stranger. Then Eleanor noticed. Her eyes snapped toward the disruption. I watched her gaze travel from the hem of the Elie Saab gown up to my face and finally settling on the Ligne Sachs cascade. I could pinpoint the exact microsecond her brain short-circuited. She knew enough about high jewelry to recognize that what I was wearing was not a replica, not a rental, and absolutely not something a gallery assistant could afford. I didn't wait for them to come to me. I glided across the marble floor, my posture immaculate, my expression pleasantly detached. Nathaniel, I said, my voice carrying effortlessly over the low hum of the string quartet. Eleanor, good evening. Nathaniel blinked, completely derailed. Eve, my God, you look incredible. That dress and that necklace, a family heirloom. I replied smoothly, touching the sapphire. I turned my gaze to Eleanor. I hope I am dressed appropriately for your appearances, Mrs. Harrington. Eleanor's pale eyes were darting rapidly, trying to run a mental calculus that was failing her. Where did you get that jewelry? Eve Christie's doesn't allow staff to borrow auction items. It has been in my family for over a century, Eleanor, I said, dropping the deferential Mrs. Harrington for the first time. I assure you it is quite securely mine. Eleanor's jaw tightened. She hated losing control, and she was currently losing it in front of the entire Harrington Equity Board of Directors. She plastered on her terrifying aristocratic smile. Well, it is certainly ostentatious, Eleanor deflected, recovering her venom. But a pretty dress doesn't change reality. The event is starting. I believe you know where your table is. Table 42. Straight through those doors near the service kitchen. Nathaniel is needed here at the head table, with his family. She emphasized the word family like a knife twist. Nathaniel looked at me, a pleading, pathetic look in his eyes. Eve, please, just go sit down. I'll come find you during the speeches. Don't make a scene in front of the board. I looked at the man I had loved for 2 years. I looked at his cowardice laid bare under the crystal chandeliers. There was no anger left in me, only a deep terminal exhaustion. I won't be sitting at table 42, Nathaniel, I said, my voice ringing with a cold, terrifying clarity. And I won't be making a scene, but I strongly suggest you and your mother find your seats. Eleanor let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. Excuse me, you arrogant little… Eleanor, a voice interrupted. Arthur Harrington. Nathaniel's usually silent father had stepped forward, his face pale. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking over my shoulder toward the massive double doors of the grand ballroom. Eleanor, Arthur repeated, his voice shaking. Stop talking. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing, the screech of a bow against a cello echoing through the suddenly silent room. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom hadn't just opened. They had been physically secured and held back by 4 men in dark suits, wearing earpieces, the United States Diplomatic Security Service. Behind them stood 6 officers of the New York Police Department's Strategic Response Group, forming a tight, impassable perimeter. A wave of confusion and alarm rippled through the billionaire crowd. Men in tuxedos instinctively reached for their wives. Eleanor clutched her pearl clutch, her eyes wide with indignation. "What is the meaning of this?" Eleanor snapped, stepping forward. "Who authorized this interruption? This is a private event. Where is the hotel manager?" A senior DSS agent stepped into the ballroom, his eyes scanning the crowd before locking on to me. He didn't acknowledge Eleanor. He didn't even look at her. He raised a heavy brass-tipped walking stick, the traditional ceremonial staff used for high diplomatic entrances, and struck the marble floor 3 times. The sharp clack, clack, clack echoed like gunshots in the dead silent room. "Ladies and gentlemen," the agent's voice boomed, rich and authoritative, demanding absolute submission from the wealthiest people in New York. "Ensure your compliance with international protocol." Eleanor froze. Nathaniel stopped breathing. The grand ballroom. The agent announced, "Now welcomes His Serene Majesty Sovereign of the House of Lean Saxe." The silence that followed the diplomatic security agent's announcement was not merely the absence of noise, it was a heavy, suffocating vacuum that swallowed the grand ballroom whole. 500 of Manhattan's most powerful figures, hedge fund billionaires, media tycoons, and legacy heirs, stood paralyzed, entirely unaccustomed to being outranked in their own city. Through the massive oak doors walked my father, King Maximilian of the House of Lean Saxe. He did not wear a crown or an ermine cloak. This was reality, not a fairy tale, but he didn't need them to project absolute terrifying sovereignty. He wore a masterfully tailored black tuxedo, upon the lapel of which rested the Grand Cross of the Order of the Lion. A starburst of diamonds and rubies that signified his status as a reigning monarch. He walked with the slow, measured cadence of a man who had never once in his life been told to wait. Flanking him were 6 members of our royal guard in ceremonial dress uniforms, an ocean of midnight blue and gold braid walking in perfect, intimidating synchronization. Behind them trailed Ambassador Henri Castille and a retinue of foreign dignitaries. The crowd instinctively parted, scrambling backward to create a wide aisle. Men who routinely fired thousands of employees without blinking were suddenly smoothing their lapels and averting their eyes. Arthur Harrington, standing just a few feet away from me, suddenly let out a strangled, breathless sound. He had spent 40 years in international finance. He knew the faces of the global elite better than he knew his own children. He recognized my father instantly. Arthur stumbled forward, bypassing his frozen wife and son. With shaking hands, he grasped the lapels of his tuxedo jacket and bowed a deep, terrified, perfect court bow, bending at the waist until his torso was parallel to the floor. "Your Serene Majesty!" Arthur choked out, his voice echoing in the dead quiet of the room. We are profoundly honored by your presence." I watched Eleanor. The woman who had sneered at my bureaucratic father, the woman who had tried to buy my absence with $500,000, stood perfectly rigid. Her icy blue eyes were wide dilated with a dawning, catastrophic horror. She looked from Arthur, still bowed in submission, to my father, and finally to me. Her fingers went slack. The crystal champagne flute slipped from her grasp. It shattered against the marble floor of the Plaza Hotel, a sharp, violent crash that mirrored the total collapse of her reality. My father did not spare the Harringtons a single glance. He walked past the trembling Arthur, stepped elegantly over the shattered glass of Eleanor's champagne flute, and stopped directly in front of me. The severe, commanding mask of the monarch melted away, replaced instantly by the warm, adoring eyes of my father. Genevieve, my darling," he said, his deep voice carrying a tender resonance. He reached out, framing my face with his large, warm hands before kissing me formally on both cheeks. "Papa," I breathed, a genuine, radiant smile breaking across my face for the first time in weeks. "You are exactly on time. A king is never late, little bird." He murmured, his eyes crinkling at the corners. He stepped back, running an approving eye over the Elie Saab gown and the magnificent Lignea Sax cascade resting against my collarbone. "You wear your great-grandmother's stones beautifully, though I must admit I was quite fond of the Zara blazers." "It was time for a change of wardrobe," I replied smoothly. Behind my father, Nathaniel was visibly vibrating with shock. His face had drained of all color, leaving him looking sickly and gray. He opened his mouth, closed it, and opened it again like a fish gasping for air on a dock. "Eve, Genevieve, what is happening?" Nathaniel stammered, his polished Yale confidence entirely evaporated. He looked at my father, then at the Secret Service agents, his mind unable to bridge the gap between the gallery assistant he thought he knew and the crown princess standing before him. My father turned slowly. The warmth vanished from his features, replaced by a glacial, unyielding authority. He looked at Nathaniel as if inspecting a particularly disappointing insect. "You must be Nathaniel." King Maximilian said, his tone perfectly polite, which made it infinitely more terrifying. "My daughter has spoken of you, though I find the reality of you severely lacking compared to her generous descriptions." Eleanor finally snapped out of her paralysis. The instinct for self-preservation, honed by decades of societal warfare, kicked in. She stepped forward, practically shoving her husband aside her face, stretching into a grotesque parody of her usual hostess smile. "Your Majesty." Eleanor cried out, her voice shrill and trembling. "There has been a terrible misunderstanding. If we had known. If Genevieve had only been honest about her pedigree, we would have welcomed her with open arms. We are a family of legacy, you see. We understand the burdens of true wealth." My father looked at Eleanor Harrington. He did not speak immediately. He simply let the silence stretch, forcing her to stew in her own desperate groveling. "Pedigree." My father repeated softly, testing the word on his tongue. "You speak of my daughter as if she were a show dog, Mrs. Harrington. I am told you ran a background check on her." Eleanor swallowed hard, her throat visibly bobbing. "It is standard protocol, Your Majesty, to protect our family's assets." "Your assets?" My father mused, a dark, dangerous amusement flickering in his eyes. He signaled casually to Ambassador Castile, who stepped forward holding a slim leather portfolio. "Arthur, approach." Arthur Harrington, sweating profusely, took a tentative step forward. "Yes, Your Majesty." "Your firm, Harrington and Sons Equity, manages a considerable portfolio, does it not?" my father asked. "Yes, sire. We pride ourselves on our fiduciary stewardship," Arthur replied, his voice shaking. "May and your anchor investor—" My father continued, his voice echoing across the captivated ballroom. "The entity that provides 64% of your firm's total liquidity, the sovereign wealth fund that underwrites your entire operation." "What is the name of that fund?" "Arthur." The collective intake of breath from the board of directors seated at the surrounding tables was audible. Arthur Harrington closed his eyes, a tear actually escaping and tracking down his wrinkled cheek. "The Royal Sovereign Wealth Fund of Lean Sax," he whispered. Eleanor swayed on her feet. Bitsy Astor, standing a few yards away, let out a loud theatrical gasp and covered her mouth. "Precisely," my father said, his voice dropping to a lethal quiet register. "My family's money is the lifeblood of your empire. You're not a dynasty, Mrs. Harrington. You are my employees." The absolute devastation on Eleanor's face was a masterclass in hubris meeting reality. The woman who had lectured me on the responsibilities of true wealth, who had banished me to a table by the kitchen doors, just realized that the very foundation of her opulent life belonged to the father of the girl she had insulted. The grand ballroom remained suspended in a state of sheer suffocating disbelief. In the ultra-elite circles of Manhattan power was usually wielded in quiet mahogany-paneled boardrooms, obfuscated by sealed legal documents, NDAs, and discreet offshore wire transfers. To witness a public execution of this magnitude, a literal sovereign monarch dismantling a Wall Street dynasty in the middle of their own charity gala, was unprecedented. The air was so thick with tension that the faint, rapid breathing of the terrified socialites was the only sound competing with the hum of the crystal chandeliers. My father turned his piercing, unyielding gaze back to Eleanor. He studied her the way an architect might study a structurally compromised building right before ordering its demolition. "I am a remarkably reasonable man, Mrs. Harrington." King Maximilian began, his deep voice carrying effortlessly across the vast room. "I allowed my daughter her freedom in this city because I trust her judgment impeccably. I expected her to encounter the usual hazards of civilian life, but I draw the line at profound, deliberate disrespect toward my blood." He snapped his fingers, a sharp, echoing sound. Ambassador Castile stepped forward smoothly, opening the slim black leather portfolio he carried. From it, he withdrew a small, familiar slip of paper, holding it by the edges. He handed it to my father. It was the check. The exact $500,000 check Eleanor had filled out and thrown at my feet in the guest bedroom of her Southampton estate just weeks prior. My father held it up to the light, inspecting the pristine handwriting with a look of mild, aristocratic disgust. "You attempted to purchase my daughter's dignity." My father said, his voice ringing with a cold, terrifying fury. He turned the check so the board members at the adjacent tables could see the amount. "You offered her $500,000 to disappear. Tell me, Mrs. Harrington, did you truly believe a princess of the blood, whose personal, unrestricted trust generates this exact sum in compound interest, every 4 hours would be tempted by your pathetic localized extortion?" Whoa. The absolute devastation on Eleanor's face was a masterclass in hubris meeting reality. The woman who had lectured me on the responsibilities of true wealth, who had banished me to a table by the kitchen doors to remind me of my place, had just realized that the very foundation of her opulent, untouchable life belonged entirely to the father of the girl she had treated like dirt. Charles Worthington, the senior managing partner and head of the board of directors for Harrington and Sons Equity, abruptly stood up from table 2. He knocked his gilded chair over in the process, but he didn't care. His face was a mottled, furious purple as he glared at Eleanor. "You offered a blatant bribe to the crown princess of our primary sovereign investor." Charles bellowed, his voice cracking with panic and rage. "Are you completely out of your mind, Eleanor? Do you have any conception of the geopolitical and financial suicide you have just committed?" "I didn't know." Eleanor shrieked, her immaculate icy facade finally shattering into a million jagged pieces. She reached out toward me, her manicured hands shaking violently. The carefully curated poise of the society matriarch was gone. In its place was a desperate, terrified woman watching her empire burn. "Genevieve, please. You must tell them. Tell them it was a test. I just wanted to be sure you loved Nathaniel for the right reasons. A mother's fierce protection, you must understand." I looked at her, feeling absolutely nothing. No pity, no residual anger, just a profound, liberating emptiness. "It wasn't a test, Eleanor," I said, my voice cool, even, and amplified by the dead silence of the room. "It was an eviction. It was a calculated cruelty. But you were right about one thing: that weekend we do not belong in the same world." I turned my attention to Nathaniel. He was staring at me with a sickening mixture of awe, heartbreak, and pure desperation. He took a sudden, frantic step toward me, reaching out as if to take my hand and rewind time. Gareth, my lead protection officer, instantly stepped between us. His hand moved in a blur, resting casually, but with lethal intent near the lapel of his suit right over his concealed firearm. His eyes locked onto Nathaniel with the cold promise of violence. "Stand down, Gareth," I instructed softly. Gareth immediately stepped aside, his discipline absolute, but his eyes never left Nathaniel's face. Nathaniel pleaded, tears pooling in his eyes and spilling over his cheeks, ruining his perfectly handsome, privileged veneer. "Please, I love you. I swear to God none of this matters to me. The titles, the money, the sovereign funds, I don't care about any of it. We can still be together. I'll leave the firm tomorrow. I'll cut her off entirely. I'll do whatever you want. Just give me another chance to prove I'm the man you met at the gallery." It was the exact speech I had spent weeks praying to hear. I had agonized in my West Village apartment, hoping he would find his spine confront his mother and choose our relationship over his comfort. But hearing those words now bathed in the glaring light of the plaza chandeliers and motivated by absolute terror, it felt hollow and pathetic. "You don't care about the titles now, Nathaniel," I said gently, offering him a sad, pitying smile. "But you cared deeply about the trust fund when she insulted my family at high tide in Southampton. You cared about the board of directors when she seated me by the kitchen doors tonight. You didn't want to protect Eve, the gallery assistant. You only want to protect her now that she wears a crown and controls your bank accounts." Nathaniel flinched as if I had physically struck him across the face. "That's not fair, Eve. I was trying to manage her. I was trying to keep the peace until we were married." A man who prioritizes his inheritance over his partner's basic human dignity isn't managing the peace, Nathaniel. I replied, my tone leaving no room for argument. "He's choosing his master. I wanted you to choose me when I was a nobody. I do not want you now." My father placed a heavy, warm hand on my shoulder, a silent gesture of absolute support. He then looked down at Arthur Harrington, who was still trembling like a leaf in a hurricane, completely broken. "Arthur," my father said, addressing the patriarch with a tone of cold, bureaucratic finality. "Effective at the opening of the European markets on Monday morning, the Royal Sovereign Wealth Fund of the House of Lean Sachs is divesting entirely from Harrington and Sons equity. Every dollar, every euro, every tangible asset. We are withdrawing our liquidity completely. Ambassador Castile will serve the formal notices to your legal department within the hour." A collective visceral groan of despair erupted from the surrounding tables where the Harrington executives sat. Divesting 64% of their operational liquidity overnight wasn't just a heavy financial blow. It was a death sentence. The firm would violently collapse before Tuesday afternoon. "Your Majesty, I beg of you, please." Arthur cried out, dropping fully to his knees on the cold marble floor. The sight of a Wall Street titan sobbing on his knees in a tuxedo was jarring. "Please do not destroy everything my grandfather built. Do not destroy thousands of jobs over the misguided actions of my wife. You allowed her to wield your generational wealth as a weapon against outsiders, Arthur. Now you shall learn exactly what happens when you carelessly strike armor." My father replied, completely unmoved by the tears. He looked down at Eleanor, who was hyperventilating, her chest heaving as the reality of her impending bankruptcy and social exile crashed down upon her, and Mrs. Harrington. King Maximilian added his voice, carrying the finality of a judge delivering a life sentence. "When you stand in the presence of a reigning monarch and his direct heir international protocol dictates that you show immediate deference. Your husband, to his credit, has remembered his manners. I suggest you remember yours." Eleanor froze. The entire ballroom held its breath, the tension so thick it could be cut with a silver dining knife. To Eleanor, Harrington pride was oxygen. She had spent her entire adult life demanding deference from the world, cultivating an aura of untouchable superiority. The thought of submitting publicly on her own territory in front of the very socialites, rivals, and employees she had lorded over for decades was a fate fundamentally worse than financial ruin. But as she cast her panicked, tear-filled eyes around the room, she saw no allies. Charles Worthington was glaring at her with a murderous intensity, mentally calculating the lawsuits he would file against her estate. Bitsy Astor, her supposed best friend, had literally turned her back to the confrontation, desperately trying to avoid any association with the sinking ship. Her own son was weeping silently, and her husband was still prostrate on the floor. She was entirely catastrophically alone. Slowly, agonizingly, Eleanor Harrington gathered the voluminous skirts of her metallic Oscar de la Renta gown. Her manicured hands shook so violently that the heavy diamond bracelets on her wrists clattered against each other. She lowered her eyes, staring blankly at the shattered remains of her crystal champagne flute on the floor. And then New York's most vicious feared society matriarch bent her knees, bowed her head, and sank into a deep, humiliating, perfectly executed court curtsy. "Your Royal Highness!" Eleanor whispered to me, her voice breaking on a pathetic, ragged sob of pure defeat. I looked down at her, memorizing the exact angle of her bowed head, the trembling of her shoulders, the absolute surrender of a bully who had finally met an unmovable force. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply offered her the one thing she had deliberately withheld from me since the moment we met: basic, polite acknowledgement. "Good evening, Mrs. Harrington," I said softly. I turned my back on her, linking my arm through my father's sturdy arm. "Shall we, Papa?" I asked, keeping my head held high. "I suddenly find the air in here to be quite stale." "Indeed, my dear," he smiled, his eyes shining with pride. "I have my jet waiting on the tarmac at Teterboro. Shall we go home?" "Yes," I breathed, feeling the heavy toxic weight of the last 2 years lifting entirely from my chest. "Let's go home." With Gareth taking the point to clear the path, and the ceremonial royal guard falling into a perfect, intimidating formation behind us, we walked out of the grand ballroom. The sea of billionaires parted for us once more, in absolute terrified silence. We didn't look back as the heavy oak doors swung definitively shut, sealing the Harringtons inside the glittering tomb of their own making. In the chaotic weeks that followed, the fallout was nothing short of spectacular. True to his word, my father executed the withdrawal of the Sovereign Wealth Fund the exact second the European markets opened on Monday morning. By Wednesday, Harrington and Sons equity was under a massive federal investigation by the SEC for a sudden catastrophic liquidity crisis. By Friday afternoon, in a desperate bid to save whatever fragments of the company remained, the board of directors forced Arthur Harrington into an immediate disgraced retirement. They simultaneously fired Nathaniel, stripping him of his equity and locking him out of the very empire he had sacrificed our relationship to protect. Eleanor, completely stripped of her financial leverage and actively shunned by her horrified, self-preserving social circle, retreated to the Southampton estate. It was soon listed for sale to cover their mounting legal debts, a sprawling, empty monument to a dynasty that vanished overnight. As for me, I returned to my country. I locked my Zara blazers in a cedar trunk and stepped fully into the blinding light of my inheritance and my royal duties. I still loved Impressionist art, and occasionally I still missed the quiet anonymity of the New York subway, but I never forgot the critical lesson I learned in that glittering ballroom. True power doesn't need to shout. It doesn't need to belittle others, manipulate seating charts, or write checks to make itself feel tall. True power simply waits for the truth to arrive and watches quietly as the fragile, cruel empires of bullies shatter like cheap glass against marble. If you love this story of royal revenge and ultimate karma, don't forget to hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves a dramatic twist, and subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable real-life stories. Ring the notification bell so you never miss an update.